and welcome to the lecture on the aggregate method or function, which is AGG. In this lecture we'll see how to use the aggregate method. Aggregation basically means transforming our data into a scalar value, and we can use functions that we've been using with a group by object like mean, sum, count, maximum, minimum, standard deviation, and so on. We can use all of those methods with the aggregate function. We can also design our own function and then use that function with the aggregate method. Let's start by looking at the data frame that we created at the beginning of the data aggregation section. So I have the data frame here. If we run it and if we call the data frame, we see here we have a 5 by 4 data frame. What we'll do is let's group our data frame by key 1. Let's do that. So we have our data frame that group by, and we simply pass key 1. And let's save this in a variable called group key 1. And if we call our group key 1 object, we see that it's a group by object. We've seen that we can perform or call methods on our group by object like mean, and we have the mean for columns 1 and 2. There's also a method called describe, and we can call that method on our group by object, and that will give us a statistical description of our object like count, standard deviation, minimum value, maximum value, and so on. So we have a count, mean, standard deviation, minimum, maximum, then percentile, 25%, and so on. So those are in the describe method. Now let's design our own function, and then we'll use the aggregate method. Let's define a function, and that function will calculate the difference between, let's say, our maximum and then mean value. So let's do that. I'll name the function name maximum to mean. Then it will take some variable x, and this will return x dot max minus x dot mean. What we'll do next is we'll apply the aggregate method on our group by object, on our group key 1 object. Okay, let's do that. So we have our group key 1 object, and then we'll apply this function, this method, this function that we defined. So group key 1 dot aggregate, we'll call the aggregate method. So we call the aggregate method on our group by object, and then we pass the function that we define, maximum to mean. Then run it. So now we have a new data frame. It's first grouped by key 1, and then here we have 2 columns, column 1 and column 2, and these are the results for the maximum value minus minimum value obtained by using the aggregate method or function. Again, we can define our own functions to use with the aggregate function, or we can use any of the methods, any of the functions or methods that we can use on a group by object, like count, mean, and so on. Okay, let's look at another example. For this example, we'll use some CSV file that I got from a book by Bryant and Smith on business statistics. We'll be using a data from this book, and I have saved that data where my Jupyter Homebook directory is. So name of the file is tip.csv. So I saved it where my Homebook directory is located, tips.csv. So let's use Pandas read CSV method, pd.readcsv, and then we'll pass name of the file, tips.csv. If you save this file somewhere else, you have to enter the exact directory. If it's somewhere else, will be whatever directory you've saved it, you can pass it here. And let's save this in a variable called tips. So if we look at our tips dataset, tips.head, so it has the following columns: total bill paid by the customer, the tip they left, sex, whether male or female, smoker, yes or no, what day it was, time, and size, that size of the family. What we'll do next is add one more column, and we'll name that tip percentage, and it will be tip divided by the total bill paid, and that will give us the percentage of the tip. Let's do that. So our tips data frame, and then we'll be dividing the tip column by the total bill paid. So from our tips data frame, we'll take the total bill, and then we'll save that in a variable called, let's say, percentage tips. Okay. It says percentage tips is not defined. Oh, let's put this in quotation. Okay, let's run it again. Now if we look at our tips data frame, we see that a new column is added, percentage tips, and that's the amount of tip divided by total bill. Next, let's group our tips data frame by sex and smoker. So we have our tips data frame, and then we'll call the group by method, and then we'll group it by sex and smoker. And let's save this in a variable called tips group. Now if we call our tips group object, we see that it's a group by object, and we can apply various methods on this tips group by object. Similarly, all those methods that we can apply, we can use them with the aggregate function. So we can call the aggregate method on our tips group by object, so that aggregate, and then we can pass, for instance, mean, and that will give us, see, first it's grouped by sex and smoker, and then we have aggregated our group by object, and then the mean is calculated for total bill, tip, size, and percentage tips. Similarly, we can call other functions on our aggregate. So tips group that aggregate, and then we can call, let's say, the maximum function, and that will give us the maximum. We can even pass more than one function. We can do that by passing it as a list. Let's see an example of that. So we have our tips group by object, and then that aggregate, and then when we want to pass more than one function, we pass it as a list. Let's say we can pass the mean, maximum. We can even pass the function that we created earlier. We created a maximum to mean function. Let me grab the name. So maximum to mean. We can even pass that function, maximum to mean. Now if we run this, you see that we have our mean, maximum, and then maximum to mean. You have all those three functions that we called by using the aggregate method.